when Gabriel Fauré composed this 13th and last Nocturne for piano, after almost 40 years of his composer's life composing nocturnes, at least the 12 before this, it took long time because he was in 23 and he dies in 24, and he started writing them in the mid-1880s. So this one is apart. First and foremost, for the anecdote, is the only Durand publisher score of his. Amel was his edition publisher before and through his life. He was unhappy, or not jealous, but perhaps a little bit envious that he wrote to Durand that he's director of the Conservatory of Paris, organist at the Madeleine Church, professor of Ravel, who is himself published by Durand and not Fauré. So I guess for Fauré, writing this nocturne was also a recognition to publisher. It's awkward to say because at almost 80 he shouldn't have cared, and probably he didn't. That's anecdotic. The fact is that he was deaf, and he was deaf already for quite a while. And when he composed this music, he heard it all, of course, like all composers, inside himself, but that even when they're not deaf, they do. Meanwhile, his writing is so deeply intense, as if going to the heartland of the emotion without any of the frills of it, to the point of which this austere beauty has a little bit of drawback because it's extremely colliding for the voice leading, and especially intensely sometimes bundled. And so, unless voiced in a continuous melodic way, in layered tracks that have to express themselves through most likely interaction, it becomes extremely difficult because the listener hears then only the consequence of this late dissolving in resolutions, dissonances in passing tones. He already has this kind of intense dissonant situations in earlier nocturnes from the more romantic era time of his composition, when he would do and not only, but Sixth Nocturne, for instance, but in the 30th Nocturne it's almost every note. And the melodic design of the leitmotif drop third is everywhere. Intricate voice writing, a la string quartet, is also written among the time he composed his only string quartet. Again, Ravel, his student, composed his famous quartet, and considered, of course, already then as a masterpiece of counterpoint, and also graceful music, of course, mostly. Not just that, sounds like an ingredient of medicine. No, it's really spiritual. And I guess Fauré delayed writing his own string quartet almost most of his life. In the end of the slow movement of his only string quartet, opus 121, in the coda, violin 1 and 2 interactions between third, diminished minor second, in two neighboring tones play until they resolve. He loved loved Playdel cadence, partly because of his Niedermeyer school education, where his father sent him as a child by a paid church education to become a French church musician. So of course, the Amen of the Playdel cadence always was overwhelming compared to the tonal perfect cadence, if not modal. In the opening of his Requiem, so he does have predilection for the Playdel cadence, for the subdominant gravitas, rather than the tension of the tritone of the dominant. In a way, he uses it with a modal way differently, but in the middle section in G sharp minor, he uses a dictone in G sharp minor. Descending minor, modal. This vulnerable strength of the elegance of the voice leading with the grave, gravitas, profoundness, depth, not darkness per se, but a certain austerity of the beauty that goes to the essence of the thought, that is not to do with seduction by thrills. I mean, of course, he did this in the second Nocturne, some 30 years earlier. In the same B major key as the 13th last Nocturne, with a very austere already middle section in B minor in the second Nocturne. And here is middle section in G sharp minor, he has this continuous arpeggios passing from one hand to the other, and this time they are not harp-like. Sixth Nocturne. Representing some kind of nature's bliss, and two hands passing each other's the torch. Very much like harp. Here it is. More broken, more dark, in the sense of immersion in essence of the matter, without the seduction of the matter. The descending third, the leitmotif in the melody. There. And again. Exploring this vast motion of englobing every possible tonality of our G-sharp minor in a bridged direction that brings us to some endless horizons. The left hand has its own in the bass melodic line with a separate characteristic of rhythm also and motivically. This kind of flow of triplets in the two hands arpeggios, Niagara Falls of sorts. And of course, if these two elements are played together without pedal, they sound very dry. With a lot of substitutions in the melody to remain connected, but not blurred by the pedal that would hold. And harmonized, chordalized, the arpeggiated, interlaced two hands and alternated arpeggios. So I think it's good to maintain a certain dryness of this texture in order to let the melodic line, at least on the top, shine and not be clogged by the amount of course, the arpeggios were played on pleyels and erards, which are the pianos Fauré used, which are very much harp pianos in many aspects of their tonal construction, and they had this kind of resonance of thin sounds that sort of heavenly collide, or sometimes contrast, and most of the time build together without heaviness without stiffness of sound. And I think that he probably, of course, having been a pianist as well as an organist, and having heard a lot of both, since he wrote for a harp and organ and piano and voice and everything, writing this 13th Nocturne as a musical testament at the end of his long life, I think that he heard elements that need to be, I think, colliding, and some of them be heard. So the melody can be heard extracted, like in the opening section. Has an 8th note rest, 3 8 notes to allow each first note of the melody bridged through to be heard and not to be. And then when it comes in D major, so when he plays fast in G sharp minor, this brooding writing with chorale and variations and ornamentations, and the chorale in large value, the theme melodically overwhelmingly on top, like in Franck's Prelude Chorale Fugue. I don't think it was the right harmony, and I don't think that Fauré would have enjoyed that, since I think they had a little bit of a different point of view on music. But both giants and founders of such an amazing music schools with their students, Fauré with Ravel, Mlle Boulanger, Enesco, and so many, and Coquelin, for those who know him, and Roger Ducasse, and Honegger, and Franck with Dindy, Vidor, Chausson, Dupont. Just mentioning their names, I can hear their harmonies like, Anyway, be it as it is, that certain things cannot be described and they have to be just played, obviously. In the development of that B section that is so turmoiled and emotionally driven, to say the least, he reaches a series of scales. drastically, and then all of a sudden, something that only mid pedal can help is his customary of this semi-chromatic or semi-melodic and semi-diatonic. Well, then it cannot be all semi, so a third of each. Not completely chromatic. Scales which ornate this grand chorale of descending third, since we get it in the beginning. Different harmonization. If we could play it together, it would be better. So anyway, those scales are there to enhance the statement of the climax of the middle section. Of the exposition in B minor. He didn't have a middle pedal, a so-called sostenuto pedal, so he must have held, and then, so how soft can you play the little scale in sixths, not to completely overwhelm the spectrum of sounds? And if you put the middle pedal, isolate the chord, then the scale emerges out of it like in a volcano. But you can follow them equally in parallel. And the second... speculate again that this kind of harp resonance of some soft sound in the top register on his piano or in his imagination of the piano. In that sense, he's very much close to Beethoven, composing these kind of unrealistic resonances, being deaf and defying the reality of the sounds in the power of his imagination, of his desire, the power of his through the piano going to a larger spiritual design. Staccato in pedal 30 seconds. Which is per se impossible to exist, but he notates it as if to go beyond the limitations of the instrument, or perhaps of the time period, or perhaps even of the human condition, right? Something bigger than us, higher than us. Aim for a higher element of our transcendence when we are all focused towards it. To play it with the two pedals, I have to play softer the chord, the scales, and louder the chord. But then they don't have the drive. And with one pedal, it's probably what he imagined. What we need to do, even if the middle pedal of the modern piano allows us a certain compartmentation of the elements which he personally collided in this moment of climax, and accept that there is certain level of grit where things have to be so dissonantly interlaced in order to return as vanquished by the energy of the middle section in a resignation, an acceptance. In a very peaceful pace. recapitulation which is mirroring for most of its, well, at least half of it, the opening itself. In the exposition, one has always a different way to play when it comes after the storm of G sharp minor middle section than when you start is after the silence before the music and the silence at the end after the music. And in the example I played earlier, I started the opening extremely slow because I wanted to hear the length of sound and savor each voice leading and try to convey it. The tenor, the soprano, the alto, the bass. Descending third in the soprano, syncopated drops by step motion of the tenor, and then the entrance of the bass in imitation. The tenor crossing over the alto, or the dominant of the dominant, through a suspension of wetted fifth, in the size down, which is the drop of the octave after the drop of the third. Essentially driven by the melodic drop of flux, influx, breathe and exhale, while at the same time inside voicing is all intricate. And so by the time you want to display that and want to drive through the topography of the landscape, creating this general mood that is framed in your interpretation. The pedal can blur or clear, the fingers can voice or bunch, the melodic line can spread and soar or go by waves. The driven lack of downbeat in this constant syncopations in large values reminiscent of string quartet writing with bow sustained or vocal polyphony. It's almost an impossible task because if you focus on the detail, you still need to organize the grand gesture. La grande ligne, la note choisie. Mademoiselle Gervais, who was my analysis teacher at the Paris Conservatory, used to say to my students, and I invited her to give a conference in my academy in Gargenville years ago. She said to the students, "Vous savez, Fauré, c'est mon pays." So she didn't have to explain much more. Fauré is my country. That's what she said. Or we could say that also of Scriabin is my world, or Schumann is my universe, and Beethoven is my credo. You know, I understand that, but because Fauré is lesser known or thought of in such, other than for an occasional song in a school for a skill, or in an occasional performance of a chamber work of his, preferably in the early period, where he resembles to most people more to Brahms and Grieg than to Chopin, than to himself in the later period, second quartets and second cello and violin sonatas and so forth. He had distinguishedly two periods in his composition over the many decades, which all the nocturnes cover in a continuous almost way. But regardless of the aesthetic choices of Fauré, he remains a little bit less than unknown. At most he is considered, which is already a lot, but not really known. So when somebody says Fauré is my country, it appears almost eccentric, because is there enough? But yes, there is enough for a country of Fauré. Not only a plagal cadence and a contrapoint and a church music and a model organization with semi-chromaticisms and singing melodic basses and displays downbeats for the accompaniments which allow the melody to soar by itself and be heard, and a constant horizontal hearing which he probably inherited by the contrapoint exercises he did at the Niedermeyer school, where they used to practice, he used to tell my teacher, in a grand cafeteria room, like 60 pianos upright once at the same time, because they didn't have separation, so they had to focus on listening to themselves while hearing everybody play at the same time. So perhaps he developed all kinds of skills while he already had them in his inspiration about the technique of writing polyphony, thinking polyphony, breathing polyphony, exhaling polyphony, as great masters Bach and Mozart did in their chamber and sacred works. He was among those, in that lineage of his own, and I think that his music is more intemporal than just impressionist, symbolist, or post-romantic, or early modern, or tonal with modal output. One can describe it musicologically as what wants. Of course, very often he has these harmonic progressions which are purposely ambiguous between pivotal notes, like is it going to be this, or this, or this, or this, or this, or this, with a pivotal note. So he, for analysis in terms of harmonic motions of the chords, he's not very clear and easy to follow up, because his melodic bass, his melodic soprano part, if it is soprano, and his moving inner parts make him constantly in evolution. His music never settles down on a ostinato, rarely, perhaps in the Liberame of the Requiem, insisting on a sort of characteristic basso, but most of the time is in this kind of motion of the bass line, which complements the melody like great masters did in the past, but in his case continuously so. So all these elements of grand distinction of his style, of phrases that soar without need of perfect per se climax, and at the same time they nourish themselves in a run-on sentence that is equal to Bach's greatest aria lines that spread over pages, and sentences that need nothing else because of their not picturesque but also legend size emotional trigger that brings the listener to hear things way beyond the scope of a nocturne, as we know it from Chopin, who already, with an amazing melodic line, develops in few bars an unbelievable mood that makes us just regret it as soon as it's over and want to hear it again. In Fauré, he's a little bit more complex because of his probably deafness, in my opinion, but not only, also because he was getting closer and closer to the concentric rounds to the point of his thought process. Compared to my original performing opening adagio, is more appropriate for understanding of the voice leading in the sense of the view of the arrival point, because if it's too far, too slow, too stretched, you don't see the horizon line. It's beyond those mountains, and so you imagine it, you hope it, but you really don't. You cannot project yourself into it as in a more moving tempo. The soprano, the middle voice, the tenor, chromatic, and this and that, and of course at the same time rather than in this and that. And if you end up by playing it more lively and more driven and more phrased and more waved, then it loses its sense of kind of patriarchal calm. Should I try to play it more moving? Starts being fidgety already, and if I'm in a more ecstatic, stretched values tempo, compose something on the get-go that is extremely severe, austere, but profoundly good, and not angry nor tense for a release. It's just a constant projection forward to a lasting horizon line. That's all I always think of. And when you play the same thing after you come from the slightly put faster together, and you return, you hear the opening section as an echo of the middle section, but more whispered to your soul by yourself, not projecting per se to the audience, as if in a soliloquy, just to yourself. What have I done? What have I accomplished? It's kind of a philosophical self-questioning that yearns the highest level of honesty, and where you cannot hide behind ornaments, decorations, and modulations, and whatever effect. That's why it's sort of concentrated on the middle of the keyboard within a fifth. Couldn't be more bundled for the parts compared to the or Sisyphus, step by step. And then it breaks down, trying to rise, and again breaks down, and then escapes. And then the arpeggios, and the chorale remaining, just the third. That third, since the beginning, symbolically, in A with a D, in D major with an A, or with a B in B minor. And the staggering energy of that rest after this plethora of notes. And here, and not. Just for the purpose of the example. How striking it is to go from the scales to the rests. And therefore the recap has a dimension of introspection that the opening can't have. For an elevation of the spirit from the acceptance of the situation after the exuberance of the revolt of the middle section to the understanding. A bit like he did in the Requiem with the Requiem's Liberame middle section. in this revolt against the condition of mortals of the Requiem by Fauré, he ends with the acceptance of that condition with his In Paradisum, which follows the Libera Me in question. It is a Bach chorale for organ, or sorry, he writes it with such transcendent inspiration. I don't know, even saying it sounds silly. It's so obvious, devastatingly overwhelming, or at the same time uplifting, and at the same time realizing what it brings us as a perhaps cruel or acceptance of our condition, with such heart and soul and not anger. And in the nutshell of the 13th Nocturne, in comparison to the Requiem stretch of form, shape, orchestration, chorus and all, obviously not on the piano as much, but hinted, suggested, dreamed, hopefully not too much reduced in that idea of reduction, since it's only the piano. The idea of the intensity of this, I call it healthy revolt, resulting then the acceptance. But unlike the Requiems in Paradisum, which ends so heavenly as its title of the movement in major, here he remains till the end in B minor. He could have finished with a certain, perhaps, redemption moment. He didn't. And the tonal relationship in the 13th Nocturne is very striking, because yes, we have the B minor exposition, F sharp minor first modulation, D major another third modulation, first major triad tonality, but immediately middle section in dark G sharp minor, not in any relative major of B minor. So the middle section is dark and driven, and the opening section is dark and philosophically, I guess, more settled. But B minor, G sharp minor, B minor. That's what the 13th Nocturne is in terms of the general choice of tonalities. Modal as well, not all tonal. And for instance, in the comparison I gave earlier of the second Nocturne, which starts in this heavenly B major. Such a daydreaming, such an elegance, never overwhelmingly sweet either. Well, it depends how it's played. So this kind of B major is just there to highlight us, enlighten us, doesn't even, oh, it's so welcoming. And then the middle section, in this case, is B minor. This more austere, again the word that comes to mind, my adjectives in English aren't large enough in my knowledge of this vocabulary to express the different shades of austerity, of gravitas, of drivenness, and of integrity in the honest approach of the revolt. And then no anger, therefore, just generous, passionate drive. And then contemplative, accepting well-being. In the recapitulation. Of course, B major, B minor, B major. In the first Nocturne, which he wrote in the 1870s, uses narrative alto, soprano with repetitivity in the chords and the melodic bass as usual in E flat minor. It's all one running sentence dropping since the beginning, melodically, from high E flat to the bottom E flat. So E flat minor, E flat minor, and very flat minor. And the middle section, in E flat minor. So this kind of atmospheres that he creates musically about darkness, about shades, about a little bit of a smile, but all driven with austere darkness, perhaps more than darkness. It's inner light without shining light. And it's a guide forward, and it gives a sense to the performer of a guideline, where to go, how to organize the phrase without to belittle with tenuto and waves, and search for a temporary arrival point of a climax, this climax, that. One could make it sound like that, but then it's not in the DNA essence of his musical thought. How do I know that? I really think it's obvious in the music, but perhaps it is only because my teacher was his student, and that she spoke not of him as a man as much as very little, while she spoke of him as intemporal modern composer, less revolutionary rhythmically or harmonically of a Stravinsky compared to, let's say, also Debussy and the parallel chords of the scales of whole tone and all this. He remains more traditional in his language, while adapting it in his own way, just like Chopin did the tonal system of his own, and so on. He just didn't revolutionize the system, he just adapted it to his musical discourse, to the meaning of what he has to convey. And there isn't a one single way to play him that was right or one that is wrong. It's always to be rediscovered, and the more people will rediscover him or discover him in terms of his music, not of him, they will most likely find different meanings to them of his music. That is the case for most composers anyway. The more famous ones we tend to play by popular ear, and the less ones by our eyes, more analytically. It's like as if we learn a foreign language as adults by grammar and drills and classes, and the mother tongue we hear by ear, and we grow up with it before we know even how to write it or what the sounds mean. We just enjoy it phonetically. And I think in some aspects his music is to be enjoyed phonetically without a meaningful organization of things, and then little by little it reveals itself by its contents, and then it becomes dramatically driven or emotionally uplifting. And I think his music has this kind of universal appeal. At least I'm convinced of that, not because of his superiority to this or that school or country, or he's just, he just shines on his own. And I'm very blessed that I was introduced to his music by my teacher in the daily life that I was sharing with her in music since I was 7, and she was already 80 many. That there were no hierarchies that were imported or injected in me of small masters, great masters. It was the work, the masterpiece, the composition, not even the ranking of the composer, if that was ever never even meant. But inevitably, when you talk of Beethoven, Mozart, Haydn, Schubert, you talk of the giants that are already established before you go to study with anybody, that less with somebody like her, who was confidant and teachers of people like Copland and Stravinsky and Ravel and who knows, Gershwin, but not, didn't happen. Anyway, it's not like as if we have to rediscover the hierarchy of the importances of the composers, but the humility to just accept the piece for what it is and try to understand what it is and serve it. And if it's a Beethoven sonata, a Fauré Nocturne, or a Messiaen Regard, we work on it for what it is, which it is very much, but not in the concept of this is lesser because this composer is secondary, as we like to think in ranking them sometimes in books or organizations, just for the sake of organizing the plethora of composers among the ones we have to study, learn, know of, and if curious, discover more of the forgotten ones, fairly, unfairly, and that is then becoming almost like discovering more and more stars when you watch the sky, and you never have the final chart of the skies, because it's always some other supernova, some other quasar, some other black hole that is revealed, and then we open our imaginations to other universes, trillions of whatever miles, light miles away, and so on and so forth. When I speak of things I don't know, I sound very blurry, which I am. But what I wanted to say, the concept of it is that if Fauré is its own country or universe, or I think it's not a locked-in universe, it's not something hermetic to itself. I would say it's more like porous to the others. And that's why he was such a, according to my teacher, inspiring teacher himself, with such variety of students as a Fauré, as a Ravel, excuse me, of course, and Mademoiselle Boulanger, who was a child prodigy girl at the time, when Ravel was already a young man. And established so, because when he came to the class one day and played his jeu d'eau, Fauré stood up and said to the other students, I think we should go home and meditate over this, because we cannot hear anything after this today. It's so good. And so capable of generous and critical also, of course, advice, as well as composition teachers do. But in this case, she even mentioned he never gave example of his own compositions in order to, let's say, explain a choice that has to be done, a cut that he would suggest, or rewriting a theme development or something. He was more respectful of the others. And she recalls on his deathbed, he was telling her in 1924 in November that he recalls her own composition attempts when she was a young student of his class some 20 years earlier, or 30, and she had almost wet eyes when she recalled that he did recall the melody of one of her pieces, and he sang it to her with his feeble voice on his deathbed, saying, Ma petite Nadia, tu aurais bien dû continuer. My little Nadia, you should have continued to compose. It was worth it. This little melody that you composed, I don't know what piece, because she didn't mention her own music, but she mentioned as an example of his openness to the others, even to her music, which she abandoned composing after the passing of her sister Lily, who was a composer. Anyway, these are her choices, but what I meant to say is that I heard about some of these aspects anecdotically of him as a teacher, but mostly about the musical phrasing, the DNA of his organization of the voicing, the meaning of his cadence and punctuation, and how to organize that, how to display it. So it is not Scriabin, but it could have been, if you take it slightly rubato. It could have been Rachmaninoff if you took it a little bit more dramatically. It could have been Liszt or Chopin if you took it a little bit perhaps in a different... I mean, there are mirrors and point of views and prisms from every composer. You can look at different and say, oh, this is an influence of this and this is an influence of that, Brahms by Beethoven, and so on and so forth. But that wasn't the point. We were not there comparing him to others, or we're just working on what is his melodic line telling us, what is this descending third in the melodic line of the 13th, and how we organize that melodic line and we serve it in humble musicianship and realizing the voices and I mean, one can always extrapolate and say that it's only what it is, but it is because what it is, and then out of it we can drive more things, and perhaps it carried or didn't, but that's what we see in it. And she didn't oblige us to see it her way, but she opened our eyes analytically to understand and to, more than understand, to appreciate and therefore understand the beauty of the melodic line design and the way he directs his elegant and eloquent motion in music, how he holds himself in terms of, not himself obviously, the music of himself. I recall some of my birthdays I had to play, well, most of them, in a party she would organize to celebrate my birthday, and then it would inevitably end with a composition that I had written for the occasion, and then, which I thought was silly as a child. Why do I make my own gift for a birthday when I normally receive gifts? But anyway, that was besides the point. Grew up to understand more later. But on the spot, I was asked often to play a Nocturne by Fauré since I was studying them, like the Well-Tempered Clavier, like Beethoven sonatas, as I said, in that non-hierarchized essential music library to know, basically. And since she had invited some of my composition, piano, chamber music, analysis, conservatory teachers who were slightly younger than her, but to me they're equally old because they're all beyond the 70s and so on, when I was 10 and 15 later. But anyway, it was Emile plays his Nocturne by Fauré for us to sort of end the soirée and before we all go home. And it became a tradition for me to play on my birthday a Nocturne by Fauré in front of my teacher and my other teachers gathered around. And it was sort of like, did Emile progress? And did Emile solve the enigma of the melodic line of this 13th Nocturne after every year trying and failing? Probably more that. And because the essential depth of the music is so intense that Mademoiselle Boulanger didn't like to talk after the piece ends. And so there was always often this kind of disturbing long silence. And since she was the senior among everybody in the room, everybody was just holding their breath until she speaks to start even breathing, let alone speaking, or afraid to say something perhaps silly, which happened to one of my teachers, Mademoiselle Bousseau, who, educated and marvelously intelligent as she is and refined and knowledgeable of all French music and more. It's not like she was somebody coming from nowhere, not knowing anything. She just couldn't sustain that tension, intensity of the pregnant silence after Fauré's music, after I finished there's a silence. And she broke the silence almost as a girl, a child, when she was in her 80s, saying, "N'est-ce pas, mademoiselle, que ce nocturne est charmant," something, "Isn't that charming nocturne?" And of course it was a ill-chosen adjective for such a austere work to call it such, and charming, as she called it. Mademoiselle Boulanger, all of a sudden, was so kind during the soirée, as she was like acting as a sort of like a surrogate great-grandmother of mine, but at the same time with expectation of perfection, which of course I couldn't reach, but that she knew. And all of a sudden she turned to this colleague of hers, my piano teacher, in this situation, embarrassing me indirectly by telling her, "Madame, Fauré's music is not charming or pretty. If anything, it's beautiful or it is not." And then she sort of called her away. She said, "Goodbye, Madame." And she had to leave the room in sort of momentary disgrace, in some kind of salon, which it was, of the 19th century, which it was, even if it's intemporary in the 20th. And I was just simply embarrassed because I had to face my piano teacher the next day in the conservatoire, and I felt like I was put between, anyway, in between, as we say. But anyway, it was for me nowadays, when I think about it in retrospect, as a charming snafu. And I think of it as a great moment of having lived that time period with these old ladies surviving this 19th century and the wars of the 20th, when I arrived as a child to be presented to her in the early 70s. And so, yes, I did receive a certain message about Fauré's music, but as I said, not in a sacred way of mission to believe that I hold some kind of truth of knowledge of it. Not at all, as a matter of fact. Always to be rediscovered, always humble in front of the muse we serve, humbly, sincerely humbly.